She said everything was great. Amazing, actually. The best she'd ever had. She said this while already planning her exit strategy, already composing the text she'd send tomorrow explaining why they shouldn't see each other again, already filing away this experience in the mental folder labelled never again. He believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was enthusiastic. She made the right sounds. She said the right words. Everything indicated success. He went to sleep confident that he'd performed well, that connection had been established, that this was the beginning of something. She lay awake cataloguing disappointments she would never articulate. Not to him, not to anyone, really. Because the things that actually went wrong aren't things women discuss openly. They're filed away as private frustrations, mentioned only in the safest conversations with the closest friends, often with laughter that masks genuine distress. The gap between what women say about intimate experiences and what they actually feel about those experiences is enormous. The gap exists because honesty carries costs, because protecting feelings seems kinder than expressing truth, because articulating what's actually wrong requires vulnerability that exposure doesn't seem worth. Today we're examining what women actually dislike, but rarely express, the frustrations that accumulate silently, the disappointments that end relationships without the real reasons ever being stated, the patterns that repeat because the feedback that would correct them never arrives. This isn't meant to create anxiety, it's meant to create awareness. The man who understands what's actually happening can address what's actually happening. The man operating on false feedback continues making mistakes he doesn't know he's making. The question arrives after everything concludes, sometimes immediately, sometimes the next morning. Always with the same underlying anxiety barely concealed beneath casual phrasing. How many times did you finish? The question reveals everything about how he's framing the experience. It wasn't connection. It wasn't mutual enjoyment. It was performance with measurable outcomes. He's requesting his score. He's asking for the data that will let him evaluate himself against whatever benchmark he's using. Women hate this question. Not because they don't want him to care about their experience. They do. But because the question transforms intimacy into achievement testing. Because the correct answer is whatever protects his ego rather than whatever's true. Because the question creates pressure that undermines the very thing it's asking about. The woman facing this question does rapid calculation. Tell the truth and watch disappointment, defensiveness, or wounded pride emerge, or provide the number that makes him feel successful, knowing she's now established a fiction that future encounters will be measured against. Most choose fiction. The number inflates, the enthusiasm amplifies, the feedback he receives bears no relationship to the experience she actually had. He walks away confident in capabilities he may not possess. She walks away having taught him to continue doing exactly what didn't work. The underlying issue isn't caring about her experience. That would be welcome. The issue is treating her experience as his performance metric. The subtle shift from "I want you to feel good" to "I need you to feel good so I feel good about myself" changes everything. Nothing destroys attraction faster. Nothing is harder to address. The moment arrives and something is wrong. Not emotionally wrong, not compatibility wrong, physically wrong in the most basic sense. The body that was attractive across the room becomes unbearable up close. Women rarely say anything. The confrontation seems too brutal. The honesty seems too cruel. Instead, they manufacture excuses. They create distance. They end things without ever stating the real reason. He never learns because she never tells him. The pattern continues with the next woman who also won't tell him. The avoidance produces strange social phenomena. Men genuinely unaware of issues that everyone around them perceives. Relationships ending for stated reasons that aren't actual reasons. Dating histories full of quick endings with no apparent explanation. The explanation being something nobody had the courage to articulate. When women do address it, with established partners where stakes justify the discomfort, the delivery determines everything. The accusatory approach produces defensiveness. The matter-of-fact approach that normalizes the topic produces actual change. The framing matters as much as the content. The man unaware of this issue should understand she probably won't tell you. The feedback loop is broken. Self-assessment and basic preparation remain his responsibility because external correction often won't arrive until it's too late. The kissing predictor. Women have known for generations what research eventually confirmed. Kissing quality predicts everything that follows. The mouth reveals more about intimate compatibility in 30 seconds than hours of conversation could. Bad kissing takes multiple forms. The aggressive approach that treats her mouth as territory to conquer. The passive approach that offers nothing, requiring her to do all the work. The mechanical approach that follows some imagined pattern without adapting to her response. The excessive approach that introduces elements that overwhelm rather than build. Each variation communicates something. The aggressive kisser will likely be aggressive elsewhere, not necessarily in ways she wants. The passive kisser will likely require direction he should be providing. The mechanical kisser will likely follow scripts rather than reading her actual responses. Women use this information strategically. The kiss tells them whether to proceed or exit. The kiss that fails often means no further opportunity exists, regardless of what other qualities he possesses. First physical contact serves as filter that eliminates before deeper involvement occurs. The man who dismisses kissing as preliminary, as something to get through before the main event, has misunderstood its function. The woman is gathering data. The data determines everything. The event he considers preliminary is actually the evaluation that determines whether main events occur. The guidance gap. She knows what works for her body, or she thinks she does, or she's never fully explored and isn't sure herself. Regardless, the information that would help him help her remains unshared. The guidance that would produce different outcomes never arrives. Multiple barriers prevent the communication. Embarrassment about discussing specifics, uncertainty about her own preferences, fear that direction implies criticism, concern that speaking up disrupts the mood. Each barrier contributes to silence that leaves both parties operating with incomplete information. The result? He continues approaches that aren't working while she grows increasingly frustrated that he can't figure out what works. He's supposed to somehow know, or he's supposed to read signals so subtle that reading them accurately is nearly impossible. The expectation is mind reading. The reality is missed connection. Some women genuinely don't know their own bodies. The exploration that would produce self-knowledge never happened. The attention to physical response that would identify preferences wasn't developed. She wants guidance she can't provide because she doesn't possess the information herself. Other women know precisely what works, but can't articulate it. The vulnerability of specificity feels too exposing. The direction might sound demanding. The preferences might seem unusual. Silence seems safer than honesty, even though silence produces outcomes far worse than honesty would. The communication breakdown damages both parties. He's left guessing. She's left unsatisfied. Neither achieves what they could achieve if information flowed freely. The gap persists because closing it requires courage that often doesn't emerge. The rhythm and pacing failures. The physical movements that work in certain contexts fail completely in others. Intensity appropriate for later stages destroys progression when applied too early. Speed that might work after extended build-up becomes uncomfortable when everything is rushed. Women describe the same pattern repeatedly. Things start well, interest builds. Then suddenly the approach shifts to something that doesn't match where she is. The gradual escalation that would have continued building gets abandoned for direct intensity that stops progress entirely. The influence of visual media appears here. The scenarios depicted in what he's watched skip directly to intensity that real experience requires building toward. The edited presentation removes the progression that actual bodies need. He's learned from material that misrepresents how things actually work. Physical response requires warmth before intensity, requires attention before action, requires reading her actual state rather than imposing predetermined patterns. The man who understands pacing as essential rather than optional produces different experiences than the man who rushes toward conclusions. Women particularly hate sudden shifts in intensity. The approach that was working gets abandoned for something different, usually rougher. Whatever was building dissipates instantly. She's back to neutral or worse, now uncomfortable and trying to find a way to redirect without making things awkward. He reaches completion, and then nothing. The encounter ends. His experience concluded, therefore the experience concluded. Whatever state she was in, close, not close, building towards something never actually started, becomes irrelevant. The finish line was his finish line, hers didn't factor. This represents the most consistent complaint women voice in private. The one-sidedness of experience, the assumption that his completion marks mutual completion. The failure to recognize that two bodies with different response patterns might require different attention to achieve equivalent outcomes. The statistics describe what's called the satisfaction gap. The percentage of women who reach completion during encounters falls dramatically below the percentage of men. The gap isn't biological inevitability, it's attention allocation. It's whose experience gets prioritized and whose gets neglected. Women tolerate this more than they should. They accept the imbalance because raising it seems demanding, because they've been socialized to prioritize his experience over their own, because changing the pattern requires conversation that feels uncomfortable. So the pattern continues, the gap persists, the resentment accumulates silently. Each encounter that ends without her completion deposits another experience of being secondary. The relationship that seems fine to him gradually deteriorates from her perspective. She's keeping score even if she never mentions the score, the pretending phenomenon. She's performed enthusiasm she didn't feel, made sounds that were theatrical rather than genuine, provided the response that seemed expected because the response that was authentic seemed insufficient or wrong. Almost every woman has done this. The pressure to perform particular responses learned from media, expected by partners, implied by cultural scripts, produces performance rather than authenticity. She's acting a version of pleasure rather than experiencing actual pleasure. The performance serves multiple functions. It protects his ego from the reality that his approach isn't working. It speeds toward conclusion when she wants things to end. It masks her own confusion about what she actually feels. The acting substitutes for the experience that acting prevents. The long-term consequences are significant. She's trained him that his approach produces results it doesn't actually produce. She's disconnected from her own authentic responses by layering performance over them. She's established patterns of dishonesty that extend far beyond physical experience. Eventually the performance exhausts her. She can't maintain the fiction indefinitely. The relationship ends and he's left confused. Everything seemed great. The everything that seemed great was carefully constructed theatre that masked building frustration. The aggression miscalibration. Somewhere, he learned that intensity signals desirability, that roughness demonstrates passion, that aggression represents the masculine energy women supposedly want. The lessons might have come from visual media, from cultural messages, from misinterpreted experiences. Regardless of source, they produce behavior that frequently repels rather than attracts. The specific behaviors vary. Actions introduced without discussion or consent. Intensity that crosses from exciting to painful, without recognition of the crossing. Language that degrades rather than enhances. Physical handling that bruises rather than embraces. The line between passion and harm gets crossed casually, as if the crossing were normal. Women encountering this face difficult calculations. Speaking up risks conflict. Going along risks damage. The consent that should precede significant intensity often never gets established because he assumes consent exists for things that actually require explicit agreement. The influence of extreme visual content appears prominently here. The scenarios he's absorbed present behaviors as standard that are actually edge cases requiring explicit agreement and careful negotiation. The normalization of the extreme produces men who attempt things that most women neither want nor expect. The disconnect between what he's learned and what she actually wants can be total. He's been trained by content created for visual impact, not relational guidance. The behavior that performs well on screen produces suffering in actual bedrooms. She becomes unwilling participant in scenarios she never agreed to. He's silent. Completely. The encounter proceeds with no indication from him that anything is happening. No sound, no response, no feedback suggesting she's doing anything right or wrong. She's operating in information vacuum, uncertain whether he's engaged or merely present. Women hate this silence, not because they require performance. They don't want theatrical exaggeration. But natural response indicates engagement. Natural sound communicates that what's happening matters to him. The silence communicates nothing. which the brain interprets as negative signal. The opposite extreme, exaggerated response that seems performed rather than genuine, produces different but equally negative effect. She can tell when sounds are artificial. The performance reads as strange rather than flattering. She prefers honest silence to dishonest enthusiasm. What women want falls between the extremes. Natural response that emerges authentically rather than being performed or suppressed. The sounds and movements that genuinely indicate his state without theatrical amplification. Feedback that helps her calibrate without making her feel she's watching a performance. The men who err towards silence often don't realize they're erring. They're focused inward on their own experience. The externalization that would communicate to her doesn't occur to them. Learning that their response helps her experience requires awareness that the experience involves two people rather than one. The climax question. Dilemma. Did you finish? The question that can land a dozen different ways depending on context, tone, and timing. Sometimes it's caring inquiry. Sometimes it's performance verification. Sometimes it's pressure disguised as consideration. The intent determines whether it helps or harms. When asked with genuine care and no ego investment in the answer, the question can open communication that improves things. The space to say, not yet, but here's what might help becomes available. The question functions as invitation rather than demand. When asked with obvious ego investment, when the correct answer is clearly required for his emotional well-being, the question becomes trap. She provides the answer he needs rather than the answer that's true. The fiction expands. The feedback loop corrupts further. The timing matters enormously. The question asked while still engaged permits continuation. The question asked after he's concluded implies that her experience was supposed to complete alongside his, and that something is wrong if it didn't. The post-conclusion question often makes things worse rather than better. Women would prefer men who notice rather than ask, who read the physical signals indicating state rather than requiring verbal report. The man paying attention knows. The man who must ask reveals he wasn't paying attention, which is itself the problem the question can't solve. The duration miscalculation. Two failure modes exist on opposite ends of the spectrum. Too brief, over before anything meaningful develops for her. Too extended, continuing past the point where pleasure has converted to discomfort or exhaustion. The too brief failure receives more attention. The cultural messaging about duration creates anxiety that everything should last longer. The man who concludes quickly feels inadequate. The woman experiencing that quickness might feel inadequately stimulating. Both connect duration to value, but the too extended failure is equally damaging and less discussed. The encounter that continues past optimal duration becomes ordeal rather than pleasure. Physical discomfort develops. Mental engagement fades. She's waiting for conclusion rather than enjoying continuation. More is not better past certain thresholds. The ideal varies dramatically between individuals and occasions. What works one time doesn't necessarily work another. The woman who enjoyed extended experience yesterday might prefer brief experience today. Fixed expectations about duration miss the variability that real experience involves. Reading her state determines when things should conclude. The body provides signals indicating whether continuation serves pleasure or extends beyond it. The man reading those signals calibrates naturally. The man following predetermined standards continues when he should stop, or stops when he should continue. He's doing everything technically correct. The movements are happening. The technique reflects what he's learned. But something crucial is missing. The experience feels like procedure rather than passion, like checklist rather than connection. The mechanics are present, but the soul is absent. Women describe this as among the worst experiences, not because anything is physically wrong, but because the encounter feels like being operated on rather than being connected with. She's a body receiving technical attention rather than a person sharing experience. The absence of presence makes the experience empty. The presence that's missing involves attention, eye contact, responsiveness to her rather than execution of predetermined patterns. It involves being with her rather than doing things to her. The distinction seems subtle but produces drastically different experiences. Many men have learned technique while missing essence. They've acquired information about what to do without developing the capacity to be present while doing it. The information produces technical competence. The presence produces connection. The former without the latter is hollow. The mismatched drive challenge. She wants more than he does, or he wants more than she does. The mismatch creates friction that extends far beyond physical experience into relationship satisfaction overall. The partner with higher drive feels rejected. The desire they express meets inadequate response. They begin wondering whether they're undesirable, whether the relationship has problems, whether something is wrong with them or with their partner. The partner with lower drive feels pressured. The desire they don't share gets requested repeatedly. They begin feeling guilty for not wanting what the other wants. The guilt converts to resentment. The resentment damages the relationship overall. Neither party is wrong. The drives are what they are. Compatibility issues in this domain don't indicate character flaws in either person, but incompatibility here causes problems that radiate outward into every aspect of the relationship. Women often tolerate mismatches longer than they should. They provide what's wanted even when they don't want it themselves. The accommodation seems like good partnership. Over time, it becomes self-betrayal. The resentment from chronic self-betrayal eventually destroys what accommodation was trying to preserve. The body awareness gap. Some women don't know what they like because they've never learned. The exploration that would produce self-knowledge didn't happen. The attention to their own body that would identify preferences wasn't developed. They arrive at intimate encounters with partners knowing less about themselves than the situation requires. This produces impossible situations. She doesn't know what to guide him toward because she doesn't know herself. He's trying to read signals that she can't provide because she hasn't developed the self-awareness that would make those signals available. 3 cultural factors contribute to this gap. Messages about female desire being inappropriate or secondary, insufficient education about how female bodies actually work, shame around self-exploration that would develop understanding. The resulting ignorance isn't personal failure, it's socialized outcome. The path forward involves developing knowledge she doesn't currently possess, learning her own body before expecting someone else to understand it. This development can happen alone or with supportive partners, but it must happen for satisfaction to become possible. The consent complexity activities that require explicit discussion rarely receive it. He assumes willingness for things she hasn't agreed to. She assumes he knows what's off limits when she's never articulated limits. Both operate on assumptions rather than information. The assumptions frequently collide. Certain activities particularly suffer from inadequate discussion. Things that involve discomfort if approached incorrectly. Things that require preparation. Things that one person finds normal while the other finds unacceptable. The mismatch between expectations produces experiences that range from awkward to harmful. The woman facing unexpected requests mid-encounter has limited options. Agreement she doesn't feel, refusal that creates awkwardness, negotiation that seems impossible in the moment. The optimal path, discussion beforehand, rarely occurs because the conversation seems premature or presumptuous. The men who ask, discuss, and verify don't seem less masculine. The asking demonstrates security rather than weakness. The conversation beforehand prevents disaster during. The clarity about what is and isn't welcome allows both parties to relax into experience rather than navigating minefield. Female anatomy has specific patterns of sensitivity that many men seem never to have learned. The areas that require gentle approach receive aggressive handling. The areas that require sustained attention receive brief touch. The timing that matters gets ignored. The most common error involves intensity. The approach that would work for male anatomy doesn't translate to female anatomy. Sensitivity levels differ. What feels good to him at a given intensity might feel uncomfortable or painful to her. The projection of his experience onto hers produces approaches that don't work. The building process matters differently. Female response generally requires more gradual development. The escalation that works involves slower progression than he might prefer. Rushing the progression interrupts the building that would eventually produce the response he wants. Education about these differences rarely occurs. The information exists. The transmission doesn't happen reliably. He arrives at encounters with inaccurate models of how her body works. The models produce approaches that frustrate both parties. The aftermath. Handling. What happens after physical experience concludes matters more than most men recognize. The transition from physical intensity to whatever follows reveals something about the relationship's nature. The handling of this transition produces lasting impressions. The immediate distance, physically rolling away, emotionally withdrawing, practically checking phones, communicates that the experience was transaction concluded rather than intimacy shared. Whatever connection existed during the encounter disappears the moment the encounter ends. 3. The woman experiencing this immediate distance draws conclusions about what she meant in the encounter, about what she means overall, about whether connection is possible or whether physical use is the only thing being sought. The conclusions often prompt exit from the relationship. What women want afterward varies. Some want physical closeness, some want conversation, some want sleep. The key is attention to what she specifically wants rather than assumption or immediate self-focus. The afterward reveals whether the experience was mutual or instrumental. The long-term tolerance problem. Women stay in situations where satisfaction never arrives. They maintain relationships where their experience is consistently secondary. They accommodate patterns that never change rather than demanding change or leaving. The reasons for tolerance vary. Belief that this is normal, that her expectations are unrealistic, that good enough should suffice, that his needs matter more than hers, that women don't really need what she's missing. Each belief enables continuation of situations that don't serve her. The awakening comes eventually, sometimes through conversation with other women who report different experiences, sometimes through new partners who demonstrate alternatives, sometimes through accumulated frustration that finally exceeds tolerance. The realization that things could be different arrives eventually. The relationships that didn't survive the awakening often ended with stated reasons that weren't actual reasons. She said they'd grown apart. She said timing wasn't right. She didn't say the actual physical experience was so consistently unsatisfying that departure became necessary. The path toward improvement. The patterns described here aren't permanent. They're learned behaviors that can be unlearned. They're ignorance that can be corrected. They're communication failures that can be addressed. The situation isn't hopeless, it's just unaddressed. For women, the tolerance that seems kind actually prevents improvement. The performance that protects his ego trains him wrong. The guidance that feels embarrassing would produce different outcomes. The honesty that seems risky is the only path to satisfaction. The development of self-knowledge precedes everything else. What actually works for your body? What you genuinely enjoy versus what you've been told to enjoy? What you need versus what you've been performing? This knowledge must exist before it can be communicated. 3. For men, the feedback you're receiving is probably unreliable. The enthusiasm might be performance. The sounds might be theatrical. The confirmation might be protection of your ego rather than report of her experience. Skepticism about positive feedback serves you better than confidence in it. The attention skills matter more than technique. Reading her actual state rather than executing predetermined patterns. Noticing the subtle signals rather than requiring verbal report. Being present with her rather than performing for her or at her. Communication must become bidirectional. What works for her specifically? What she needs that you're not providing? What you're doing that doesn't work? This information must flow or improvement can't occur. The broader pattern. What women secretly hate reflects broader failures of communication and attention. The specific complaints point toward general issues. His experience centered, her experience ignored. His reference points applied, her actual needs missed. His completion prioritized, her completion incidental. Addressing the specific complaints addresses the broader pattern. The man who learns to read her state learns to attend generally. The man who develops presence develops capacity for connection beyond physical experience. The skills that improve one domain improve others. The women keeping these secrets deserve partners who could handle the truth. The secrecy protects egos that could use honest development. The protection prevents improvement that would serve everyone. The man who can hear what's actually happening, without defensiveness, without ego collapse, with genuine interest in serving her experience as much as his own, that man can build something. The information he receives will be accurate. The improvement becomes possible. For those with perspective on these patterns, what would you add? What matters that wasn't mentioned? What would help the men who genuinely want to understand? Share what might help. The conversation improves outcomes even when the conversation itself is uncomfortable. What she's not telling you probably matters. Learning to hear it, or earning the trust that would let her speak it, determines whether patterns continue or improve. The secrets exist because honesty seems too costly. Making honesty less costly is the only way the secrets become unnecessary.